Ernest Hemingway was an American literary giant and a complex cultural figure who became one of the most influential writers of the 20th century. Ernest Miller Hemingway, novelist, short story writer, and journalist, was born in Oak Park, Illinois on July 21, 1899. He came from a respectable upper-middle-class family. He had a distinctive appearance with his robust build and rugged features. Hemingway's early years were marked by contradictions and competing influences. He grew up in a conservative Chicago suburb where his father was a physician and his mother was a music teacher with artistic ambitions. His childhood was split between the genteel world of Oak Park and the wilderness of northern Michigan where the family spent summers. These contrasting environments shaped his sensibilities and would later inform much of his writing. Hemingway attended Oak Park and River Forest High School where he excelled in English and participated in sports, particularly boxing and football. He wrote for the school newspaper and literary magazine, showing early promise as a writer. His journalism work in high school taught him the value of clear, direct prose, lessons that would define his literary style. After graduating in 1917, Hemingway did not attend college. Instead, he took a job as a cub reporter for the Kansas City Star. The newspaper's style guide emphasized short sentences, vigorous language, and clarity, principles that became fundamental to Hemingway's writing. He covered crime, hospitals, and the city beat, learning to write quickly and efficiently while observing human nature in its rawest forms. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Hemingway was eager to serve. However, he was rejected by the military due to poor vision in his left eye, a defect he had concealed during his youth. Determined to participate in the war, he volunteered as an ambulance driver for the American Red Cross in Italy. In June 1918, Hemingway arrived on the Italian front. He was assigned to drive ambulances and deliver supplies to troops. On July 8, 1918, while distributing chocolate and cigarettes to soldiers in a trench near Fossalta di Piave, Hemingway was severely wounded by an Austrian mortar shell. Shrapnel tore into his legs, and he was also hit by machine gun fire while carrying another wounded soldier to safety. He spent months recovering in a Milan hospital where he fell in love with Agnes von Kurowski, an American nurse 7 years his senior. The romance ended when Agnes rejected him for another man, a betrayal that wounded Hemingway deeply and would inspire his novel A Farewell to Arms. Hemingway returned to the United States in January 1919 as a decorated war hero, though his physical and psychological wounds would never fully heal. He carried shrapnel fragments in his legs for the rest of his life and suffered from insomnia and anxiety. He moved back to his parents' home in Oak Park, but he found civilian life difficult. He felt disconnected from people who had not experienced war. He spent time in northern Michigan, fishing and trying to process his experiences. During this period, he began writing seriously, producing short stories that explored themes of trauma, loss, and alienation. In 1920, Hemingway moved to Chicago where he worked as an editor and writer for a trade journal. He met Hadley Richardson, a woman 8 years older than him with a modest trust fund. They fell in love and married in September 1921. Shortly after their marriage, on the advice of writer Sherwood Anderson, the couple moved to Paris. Hemingway had secured a job as a European correspondent for the Toronto Star, which provided income while he pursued his literary ambitions. Paris in the 1920s was the center of artistic and literary innovation, and Hemingway immersed himself in the expatriate community. He met Gertrude Stein, who became his mentor and introduced him to modernist aesthetics. She famously told him, "You are all a lost generation," a phrase that would define his cohort of post-war writers. He also befriended Ezra Pound, F. Scott Fitzgerald, James Joyce, and other luminaries of the modernist movement. Hemingway worked obsessively on his craft during these years. He wrote in cafes, developing his distinctive sparse style that stripped away ornamental language in favor of simple, declarative sentences. He believed in the iceberg theory of writing, that the deeper meaning of a story should be implicit rather than explicit, with only 1/8 visible above the surface. His early stories were exercises in restraint and understatement, relying on dialogue and action rather than exposition. In 1923, Hemingway published his first book, 3 stories and 10 poems, in a small print run in Paris. The same year, his wife Hadley gave birth to their son, John Hadley Nicanor Hemingway, nicknamed Bumby. Also in 1923, disaster struck when Hadley lost a suitcase containing nearly all of Hemingway's manuscripts while traveling by train. The loss devastated Hemingway, but he continued writing, producing new work with even greater discipline. In 1924, Hemingway published In Our Time, a collection of vignettes about war and bullfighting. The following year, an expanded version titled In Our Time was published in New York, including the short story Big Two-Hearted River, which established Hemingway as a significant new voice in American literature. The stories dealt with Nick Adams, a character based on Hemingway himself, processing trauma through fishing and immersion in nature. In 1926, Hemingway published The Sun Also Rises, his first major novel. The book depicted expatriate life in Paris and Spain, following a group of disillusioned Americans and British drifting through cafes, bars, and bullfights. The protagonist, Jake Barnes, has been rendered impotent by a war wound, a metaphor for the broader emasculation and purposelessness of the post-war generation. The novel was a critical and commercial success, establishing Hemingway as a leading voice of his generation. However, Hemingway's personal life was deteriorating. During the writing of The Sun Also Rises, he had begun an affair with Pauline Pfeiffer, a fashion journalist and friend of Hadley's. The affair destroyed his marriage. In 1927, Hemingway divorced Hadley and married Pauline. The divorce troubled him deeply. He had betrayed someone who had supported him unconditionally, and he carried guilt about it for years. After marrying Pauline, Hemingway converted to Catholicism to satisfy her family. The couple moved to Key West, Florida, where Hemingway established a new base. He continued to travel extensively, making trips to Spain, Africa, and Wyoming. In 1928, Hemingway's father, Clarence, committed suicide by shooting himself. The death shook Hemingway profoundly and introduced the specter of suicide that would haunt his family for generations. In 1929, Hemingway published A Farewell to Arms, a novel based on his experiences in Italy during World War I. The book told the story of an American ambulance driver and his doomed love affair with a British nurse. The novel was both a war story and a tragic romance, ending with the death of the protagonist's lover in childbirth. The book was a massive commercial success and cemented Hemingway's reputation as one of America's foremost novelists. The prose was lean and powerful, the dialogue realistic, and the emotional impact devastating despite the restrained style. Throughout the 1930s, Hemingway continued to write and travel. He became obsessed with big game hunting and deep-sea fishing, pursuits that fed both his need for adventure and his literary imagination. In 1932, he published Death in the Afternoon, a non-fiction book about bullfighting that explored themes of death, courage, and art. In 1933, he published Winner Take Nothing, a collection of short stories. In 1935, he published Green Hills of Africa, another non-fiction work about hunting. During this period, Hemingway's marriage to Pauline began to fail. They had 2 sons together, Patrick and Gregory, but Hemingway was often absent, traveling for months at a time. He was also drinking heavily, a habit that would worsen throughout his life. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Hemingway traveled to Spain as a correspondent. He supported the Republican side against Franco's nationalists, seeing the conflict as a struggle between democracy and fascism. He reported on the war for the North American Newspaper Alliance and also helped raise money for the Republican cause. While in Spain, Hemingway met Martha Gellhorn, a fellow journalist and novelist. They began an affair while Hemingway was still married to Pauline. Gellhorn was ambitious, independent, and fearless, qualities that initially attracted Hemingway but would later create conflict. Hemingway's experiences in Spain inspired his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, published in 1940. The book told the story of Robert Jordan, an American volunteer fighting with Republican guerrillas who is assigned to blow up a bridge. The novel explored themes of duty, sacrifice, and the complexity of war. It was Hemingway's longest novel and his most commercially successful, becoming a bestseller and later adapted into a Hollywood film starring Gary Cooper and Ingrid Bergman. In 1940, Hemingway divorced Pauline and married Martha Gellhorn. They settled in Cuba, purchasing a property called Finca Vigia outside Havana. However, the marriage was troubled from the start. Both were strong-willed and competitive, and Martha resented Hemingway's expectation that she should subordinate her career to his needs. When World War II began, Hemingway initially stayed in Cuba but eventually went to Europe as a war correspondent. He covered the Allied landing at Normandy, though he observed from a landing craft rather than going ashore. He later attached himself to the 22nd Infantry Regiment and participated in the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Hemingway's activities during the war were controversial. He allegedly led a group of resistance fighters, which violated the Geneva Convention rules for correspondence. He was investigated but cleared of the charges. During the war, Hemingway met Mary Welsh, another journalist. He began an affair with her while still married to Martha. In 1945, Hemingway divorced Martha and in 1946 married Mary, his fourth and final wife. After the war, Hemingway returned to Cuba with Mary. However, he struggled to write. He worked on several projects but published little during the late 1940s. His drinking increased and his health began to decline. He suffered from high blood pressure, liver disease, and the accumulated effects of numerous injuries from accidents and his adventurous lifestyle. In 1950, Hemingway published Across the River and Into the Trees, a novel about an aging American colonel in Venice. The book was poorly received by critics who saw it as self-indulgent and sentimental. The negative reviews wounded Hemingway's pride and intensified his insecurities about his abilities. Determined to prove himself, Hemingway worked on a new novel about an old Cuban fisherman's struggle with a giant marlin. The Old Man and the Sea was published in 1952 to enormous acclaim. The novella was seen as a return to form, combining Hemingway's spare prose with profound themes of endurance, dignity, and grace under pressure. The book won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953 and was instrumental in Hemingway receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. The Nobel Prize citation praised Hemingway for his mastery of the art of narrative and for the influence he had exerted on contemporary style. However, Hemingway was unable to attend the ceremony in Stockholm due to injuries from 2 plane crashes he had suffered while on safari in Africa earlier that year. The plane crashes marked the beginning of Hemingway's final decline. He suffered severe injuries including a fractured skull, internal injuries, and burns. He was in chronic pain and began drinking even more heavily. Reports of his death had been published prematurely, and Hemingway had the surreal experience of reading his own obituaries. The accident also worsened his mental state. He became increasingly paranoid and depressed. Throughout the late 1950s, Hemingway's health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from diabetes, hemochromatosis, and possibly chronic traumatic encephalopathy from his numerous head injuries. His memory began to fail and his writing became increasingly difficult. He worked on a memoir of his Paris years, A Movable Feast, but struggled to complete it. In 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba. Initially, Hemingway was sympathetic to the revolution, but as Castro's government became more authoritarian, the situation became untenable. In 1960, Hemingway left Cuba and moved to Ketchum, Idaho. He would never return to Finca Vigia. In Idaho, Hemingway's mental state worsened dramatically. He became convinced that the FBI was monitoring him, a paranoia that was actually based in reality as FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had indeed authorized surveillance of Hemingway due to his time in Cuba. However, Hemingway's fears went beyond rational concern into delusional thinking. He believed that his phone was tapped, his mail was being read, and agents were following him constantly. Hemingway's depression deepened. He could no longer write, which robbed him of his primary source of meaning and identity. In November 1960, he was admitted to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota under an assumed name. He was diagnosed with severe depression and treated with electroconvulsive therapy. The treatment may have temporarily lifted his depression, but it also damaged his memory, making it even harder for him to write. He was released in January 1961 but was readmitted in April after threatening suicide. He received more electroconvulsive therapy and was released again in late June. On the morning of July 2, 1961, 2 days before his 62nd birthday, Ernest Hemingway went downstairs in his Ketchum home, selected a shotgun from his collection, and shot himself in the head. His wife Mary found his body. The death was initially reported as an accident, but it was clearly suicide. Hemingway's funeral was held in Ketchum on July 5, 1961. He was buried in the town cemetery. His death shocked the literary world and the public. In death, as in life, Hemingway was a figure of fascination and controversy. His legacy is immense and complicated. As a writer, Hemingway revolutionized American prose. His spare, direct style influenced generations of writers and changed the way English language fiction was written. He stripped away Victorian ornamentation and created a modern prose style based on simplicity, clarity, and understatement. His best work, including The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and The Old Man and the Sea, are masterpieces of 20th century literature. Hemingway's short stories, including The Snows of Kilimanjaro, The Short Happy Life of Francis Macoma, Hills Like White Elephants, and Her Clean, Well-Lighted Place, are among the finest in the English language. They demonstrate his ability to convey complex emotions and situations through minimal description and dialogue. However, Hemingway's personal life and public persona complicated his legacy. He cultivated an image of hypermasculinity, celebrating hunting, fishing, bullfighting, boxing, and war. This persona influenced how his work was read and sometimes overshadowed the artistry of his writing. His treatment of women, both in his life and in his fiction, has been criticized. He married 4 times and had numerous affairs, often leaving wives for younger women. His female characters are sometimes seen as idealized or one-dimensional, though defenders argue that works like Hills Like White Elephants show sophisticated understanding of women's perspectives. Hemingway's struggles with mental health and his eventual suicide cast a shadow over his legacy. His family was plagued by suicide. His father, his brother, his sister, and later his granddaughter all took their own lives. This pattern suggests genetic predisposition to depression and mental illness, conditions that were poorly understood and inadequately treated during Hemingway's lifetime. Modern scholars have reassessed Hemingway's work and life with more nuance. They recognize his profound influence on literature while acknowledging his flaws. They see his masculine persona as both authentic and performative, a way of coping with insecurity and trauma. They understand his mental illness as a medical condition rather than a character flaw. Hemingway's influence extends beyond literature into popular culture. He became a celebrity, one of the first literary figures whose personality was as famous as his work. His image, the bearded adventurer with a drink in hand, became iconic. This celebrity status was both a blessing and a curse, bringing fame and financial success but also creating pressure to live up to an impossible ideal. In the decades since his death, Hemingway's work has remained in print and widely read. His novels are taught in schools and universities around the world. His style continues to influence writers, journalists, and screenwriters. The Hemingway aesthetic, spare and tough, remains a touchstone for discussions of prose style. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Ernest Hemingway is that he was a great artist who was also a flawed human being. His writing at its best achieved a clarity and emotional power that few writers have matched. His worst work was self-indulgent and repetitive, trading on his reputation rather than his talent. His life was marked by extraordinary experiences and achievements but also by self-destruction and cruelty to those closest to him. Hemingway represents a particular type of American artist, the writer as adventurer and public figure. He refused to separate his life from his art, believing that a writer must live intensely to write authentically. This philosophy produced great literature but also contributed to his personal destruction. In the end, Ernest Hemingway was neither a simple hero nor a simple villain, but rather a complex man who created enduring art while struggling with demons he could not ultimately defeat. His legacy includes masterpieces of American literature as well as a cautionary tale about fame, masculinity, and mental illness. He is remembered today as one of the giants of 20th century literature, a writer whose influence shaped the course of American fiction and whose best work continues to move readers more than 60 years after his death.